Wrote about the connection about my mother, Kate Leichter, and Rosa Jochmann, as I knew, because Rosa, after the war, I would come to Vienna on quite a few occasions, and I always visited her. And she once visited us in New York, and she talked a lot about my mother. She was really such a great friend of my mother, and she told me how she first met my mother. Rosa Jochmann was working in a factory in Simmering. I think it was in the chemical industry. She was already something of a activist and maybe already part of a socialist group. But she and members of the group, after a long day of work, said, "Oh, tonight we want you to come. We've invited Dr. Kate Leichter to speak." And Rosa told me, she said, "Oh, I'm so tired. Why do I want to listen to a Dr. Leichter?" And Rosa said that my mother gave such a stirring talk about women workers and the difficulties they have and the steps that need to be taken, that Rosa said that she and her colleagues were so enthusiastic that after the speech, they all followed my mother to the Straßenbahn to see her off. And a connection was made, and then my mother invited Rosa to the Arbeiterkammer. My mother at that time ran the women's division in the Arbeiterkammer. She had founded that in the 1920s, I don't know, 24 or something. I'm not quite sure about the dates. And Rosa came, and they really established a friendship, and my mother got her more active in the Socialist Party, introduced her to other prominent socialist women like Finny Moore and others. So that a real, both a friendship and also a joint effort was really formed to work for socialist ideals. And Rosa became more and more active. And I think in 1931, she was even elected as a woman to the Central Committee, to the Women's Central Committee. After 1934 and the fascist coup, I guess it was in February of 1934, my parents fled to Zurich, and they were there for about a year, and then they came back, and my father was one of the leaders of the revolutionary socialists. My mother was also very active, and they got Rosa involved, and Rosa would hand out leaflets on the streets for the revolutionary socialists, and she was caught and she was arrested. And I was just shown a postcard that my parents sent to her while she was in jail, telling her to keep her spirits up and how much they miss her. Then, so they worked together, and then came the Anschluss, and fairly soon after the Anschluss, my mother was arrested. She could have left. She had a passport that was given her by the Czech government. My father got one, and other leaders of the Socialist Party in Austria. But she stayed because she had to make arrangements to get my brother, Heinz, and me out of Austria, and she also had her mother here. And I think she was somewhat foolhardy, but she was betrayed. It was very, very tragic. She confided to a family friend, Heinz Paff, who had worked in the Arbeiter Zeiten with my father and had become a dear family friend. And she told him when she was planning to leave Vienna, and not knowing that he had become an informer for the Gestapo. So my mother was arrested, and she was in the Landgericht, and she was actually tried for treason and acquitted. And then she was convicted of smuggling papers out of jail, and it seemed that, she would get a short prison sentence, but of course the Gestapo wouldn't let her go and sent her to Ravensbrück. And Rosa Jochmann was arrested around the same time, maybe a little later, and she was also in the Landesgericht. I don't know whether my mother and Rosa ever saw each other in the Landesgericht, but my mother was already in the Ravensbrück concentration camp when Rosa came. And Rosa told me that when she first had the chance to talk to my mother, which was difficult because the non-Jewish prisoners were not allowed to speak to the Jewish prisoners. So Rosa showed me, she said we would speak out of the corner of our mouth, and she would show me like this so that the guards wouldn't be able to tell. And she said that the advice my mother gave her, Rosa, you must do whatever the guards or the Gestapo tell you, but not for a moment must you give in and must you give up the fight against the Nazis. My mother, because she was a Jewish prisoner, was given the hardest labor. She had to unload bricks that came on a ship, and they worked. They didn't have any gloves, and she wrote a poem which unfortunately has been lost, Blutige Hände. But Rosa and some other Austrian socialists who were prisoners in Ravensbrück and were able somehow to get my mother transferred so that she was in a group that did sewing. And my mother never sewed. She didn't know how to sew. So the other women in this group, and that included Rosa Jochmann, they would do the sewing for her so that she could show the guards that she had done what she was required to do. And my mother, in the meantime, would lecture to them, give them histories of the Socialist Party, history of the French Revolution, And unfortunately, that didn't last very long. And then we believe in either February or March 1942, the Nazis decided to make Ravensbrück Judenfrei. And all the Jewish inmates, I think they were in what was called Block 11, were told that the next day they had to fall out and that there would be a transport. I think they knew that this was probably going to be the end. Well, the night before they were to leave, Rosa and another Austrian, I believe it was an Austrian socialist, Helen Pütz, that managed to sneak into Block 11, and Rosa talked to my mother, and she describes my mother probably knew what was going to happen, but she never stated it. Rosa said she was in good spirit, and we have the last words of what my mother said. So this is something that Rosa Jochmann stated, and she said, "Am Abschied sagt sie," sie being my mother, "Grüßt meine Kinder von mir und sagt ihnen, wie sehr ich nach ihnen gesehnt habe. Der Genossen aber sagt, dass ich keine Stunde meines Lebens bereue, und konnte ich noch einmal mein Leben beginnen, ich würde es genau leben, wie ich es gelebt habe." And the next day she was taken away. It's very emotional for me.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. I sort of prepared something for this moment.
Well, I if I can just continue a little bit, because from 1945 until Rosa Jochmann's death, we had a very close relationship with her. When my brother was married, he was married in Vienna. Rosa was one of the witnesses. And as I stated before, I would always visit her when I came to Vienna. And it was just amazing what a positive person she was after this terrible experience that she had in Ravensbrück. She was there almost 5 years. She was put in the bunker. She was told she was going to be shot. But she kept her strength. And when Ravensbrück was finally liberated, I guess it must have been in May of 1945, Rosa managed to get to Vienna. I guess she was an American expression, hitchhiked. She got various ways of getting, and when she got to Vienna, what she did was, she said, I had to get a bus to bring back the other Austrians who were still in Ravensbrück and had no way of getting back. And she managed to get hold of Karl Renner, and he arranged for a bus that she then took back to Ravensbrück to take back the other Austrians who were still left there. And as you know, after the war, she had such an amazing career as one of the most prominent socialists, and certainly a model for really all women. And busy as she was, she also went to schools and told the students about the horrors of the Holocaust. She was really an incredible person, and she never forgot my mother, and more than I think anyone else, she was really responsible for my mother being remembered. She got a street named after her, a housing project named after her. Excuse me, whenever I saw her, she always talked so lovingly about my mother and what my mother meant to her and the relationship. Just one final story about Rosa Jochmann. In 1958, I came to Vienna with my wife. We had just been married. It was our honeymoon. And of course, Rosa took care of us and so on. And when we left, she took us to the station. She insisted. And at one point, she said, "Excuse me." And she went off. And when she came back, she had exchanged our third-class ticket for a sleeper. We were going to Innsbruck. She was, but this was Rosa, a person of who gave so much of herself. She was an incredible woman, and no words can really describe her, but she was a person of such decency, of such moral commitment, and above all, a great believer in socialism as a means of helping people and bettering particularly working people. She was so full of humanity, an amazing person. I think that, first of all, her experience as a worker. As I said, she worked in Simmering, and she tells a funny story how in, I think it was 1931, my mother was putting together a werkbook about...
What was she putting together, your mother?
Well, my mother was putting together sort of essays about working women in various industries and so on. And she told Rosa, "I want you to write about women in the chemie industry." And Rosa said, "No, I'm not a writer, I can't do that," and so on. And my mother said, "Yes, you can," and insisted. And Rosa wrote a very good paper about what the working conditions were for women in the chemical industry. So I think these experiences that Rosa had as a worker and her belief in the policies of the Socialist Party, these were the 1920s were Rote Wien. These were certainly glorious days, and I think that very much influenced her. But as I said, she was a person of such strength and such moral commitment that her path, in a way, was always going to be to help other people. Well, it's frankly quite emotional to be here in this room and the history that occurred in this room and the papers that have been brought forth about letters and articles that my father wrote, my mother wrote, and so on, and to see them and so to think of them and Rosa Jochmann and to appreciate the idealism that they had, the real belief that you could create a better world and better conditions for working people. So for me coming to Vienna, it's always quite emotional because of a background that I consider so important in my own development. And secondly, I like being in Vienna. It's a beautiful city.
That's true.
There's a lot of good things that you can do. Culture, restaurants. So I've been here often, and it's, you know, there's some pain involved, but there's also a lot of pleasure in being here. Well, I think it's terribly important, as Santayana said, unless we know history, we're going to be doomed to repeat it. But it's very hard, particularly in the world that we live in, with all the noise, all the media, all the distraction that people have, particularly young people. I mean, I sometimes worry about my own grandchildren, whether they will, you know, fully appreciate and understand the struggle of their great-grandparents, my father and my mother, and but I think it's important to do what I mentioned Rosa Jochmann did, where busy as she was as a member of parliament and holding high positions in the Socialist Party, she always made it a point to go to schools and to lecture people, to teach young people about the Holocaust and what happened and how easy it is to undermine democracy and human values, and that knowing this and understanding this and trying to impart this to young people is so important. So I appreciate everything that you're doing to keeping alive the memory of such a great woman, Rosa Jochmann, and my mother, and what she meant to the Leichter family. Well, first of all, I'm sorry that my schedule won't allow me to be there in person, but I think it's wonderful that they're having this symposium about Rosa Jochmann, because she is such a model of really how one ought to try to lead one's life, and how important it is to have a commitment for people that goes beyond just yourself or maybe your family. So we must never forget people like Rosa Jochmann, because they are a model for us, and we should try as much as we can to follow the path that they took.